I am a man who calculates load tolerance for a living. Bridges, sea walls, flood barriers, the kind of structures that stand between a city and the water that wants to reclaim it. I spend my working days determining exactly how much weight something can carry before structural failure becomes inevitable, and I am extremely good at that work. I have never been wrong about a breaking point. I applied the same logic, quietly and without announcement, to every relationship I'd ever been in. I had been exactly right every time, which is another way of saying I had never let anything get heavy enough to surprise me. My name is Dex Calloway. I was 36 years old, a marine structural engineer based out of Port Caro, and I had spent the better part of a decade making myself useful in ways that required nothing dangerous of me. Useful was the shape I had given my life. Useful fit. Useful didn't ask you to stand somewhere exposed while the tide came in. Then the engine on the 6:47 a.m. ferry failed, and the woman at the railing turned around. I should tell you about the 4 months first. The Caro crossing runs between the residential dock on the north shore and the business district on the south side of the harbor. 11 minutes on a clear morning, 15 when the current runs west. I took it every weekday for almost 9 years because the alternative was 45 minutes on the inland road, and I have always preferred water to traffic. Something about the way it moves, constantly adjusting, weight redistributing, never actually still. It suited a specific kind of thinking. She started taking the crossing in early September. I noticed her the way you notice a new structural element in a familiar design, not dramatically, just as a factual update. She always arrived at 6:43, 4 minutes before departure. She always stood at the starboard railing, third stanchion from the bow, with a bag over one shoulder that was too large for its contents, and a coffee cup she held with both hands, even when the crossing was calm. She did not look at her phone. That was unusual enough that I registered it. She looked at the water. Not for beauty, not for distraction. She looked at it the way people look at something they're still deciding whether they can trust. I know this now. At the time, I only thought, she doesn't look at her phone. For 4 months, we stood at that railing, not together, you understand, but proximate, and said nothing. I am aware this sounds like negligence. My friend Cassius, who overuses the word criminal when he means cowardly, would agree, but the silence had developed its own architecture. Something I had not built exactly, but had allowed to form around me. The 6:47 crossing was the one part of my day with no deliverables, no load specifications, no project manager sending messages at a volume disproportionate to the actual emergency. Just the harbor, the flat morning light, and this woman who held her coffee with 2 hands and did not look at her phone. I told myself I didn't speak because she clearly valued the quiet, not because she valued the quiet, because I had started to value it too, specifically because she was in it. I need you to understand that I knew the difference at the time. I simply chose not to do anything useful with the information. The engine failed on a Thursday in January. I know it was 6:52 because I checked my watch when the deck stopped vibrating. The propulsion hum you stop hearing after the first month there, and then not there, a sound you only notice in its absence. The ferry slowed, then stopped. The harbor authority came over the speaker. Mechanical issue, service vessel, en route from the south dock. Estimated wait approximately 2 hours. Around me, the 11 other people on their early crossing responded the way people respond to unexpected stillness in a busy life. Phones appeared. Calls were made. A man in a gray coat began pacing the width of the lower deck with the purposeful energy of someone who believes motion counteracts delay. I stood at the railing. After a moment, she moved to stand beside me. Not next to me exactly, 2 feet of railing between us, which in 4 months of proximity had become its own understood distance. She looked out at the harbor. I looked out at the harbor. The water was the color of old pewter that morning, low cloud pressing the light flat. She said, without looking at me, I always wondered what you were thinking about. I turned my head. She was still looking at the water. When? I asked. Every morning. A pause. You do this thing with your jaw when you're working something out. I had no idea I did a thing with my jaw. Structural calculations, I said, which was not entirely a lie. She finally looked at me, Her eyes were dark and direct, the kind that made you aware of exactly what you had just said a half second after you said it. Mostly, she repeated, I had said that word. I know I had said it. The word mostly was practically a door I had opened myself. But I have a long and well-documented history of recognizing doors and then conducting a thorough structural assessment of the door rather than walking through it. Dex Calloway, I said. Marine engineer. A beat. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Nora Vashti. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. I photograph food. I hadn't expected that. Food, restaurants, cookbooks, sometimes packaging. She looked back at the water. People think it sounds frivolous. It isn't. You're working with light and time. Everything you're photographing is in the process of decaying. The window is extremely narrow. I thought about that. That sounds like engineering, I said. She looked at me again. This time the corner of her mouth went further. It does. She agreed the way you agree with someone who has correctly identified something you hadn't expected anyone to name. We talked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because the service vessel arrived at 9:03. And I remember watching it come across the harbor and thinking with a clarity that surprised me. Not yet. Not yet. I didn't want the engine fixed. That was new information about myself that I received standing at a railing in 11-degree weather with a woman I had shared 4 months of silence with. I, a man who had spent a career identifying structural vulnerabilities in advance, had been standing 3 feet from one for months and filed it under the quiet, sustainable, load-bearing. She told me about photographing a restaurant that wanted its dishes to look expensive versus a cookbook author who wanted readers to feel like they could actually make the food at home. Honesty in light is different from beauty in light, she said. Most clients hire you for beauty and are quietly disappointed when you give them both. I told her about the Carroll Flood Barrier project I'd been consulting on for 18 months, a seawall extension that kept running into the problem of a sandbar migrating 3 centimeters east per year, which would eventually render one of the anchor points structurally irrelevant. A sandbar that moves, she said, like she was filing it somewhere. Very slowly, I said, but consistently. She was quiet for a moment. Then that's the thing about slow movement. Everyone knows it's happening. Nobody adjusts until something fails. I looked at her. She was looking at the water, holding a coffee that had been cold for an hour. She had just described, not me. She had no idea she was describing me, but she had just described with the precision of someone who was not trying to the exact architecture of how I had lived since I was 24 years old. I did not say this, not because I had nothing to say, because some information arrives and you need to stand with it quietly before you decide what it means. The service vessel arrived. The deck vibrated again. We stepped off at the south dock in thin January light. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. Same railing tomorrow? Same railing, I said. She walked toward the business district, and I stood on the dock longer than was practical, thinking, I have been calculating the wrong things. That was January. By February, I knew which side of the railing she preferred when the current ran west. I knew she took 3 crossings a week, always morning, rarely evening. I knew she photographed restaurant dishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those were the days her bag ran heavy with equipment. I knew her coffee was always from the place on Marsh Street, not the one by the dock, because the dock coffee tasted like optimism, which was not a flavor she needed at 6:43 inches the morning. And I knew she finished my sentences, not rudely, not even consciously. At first, I would start a thought, the issue with the anchor point is, and she would complete it accurately from an entirely different discipline, that you built certainty around something that was always going to shift. Then she would catch herself, go still for half a second, and say, sorry, go ahead. I always said, no, you had it, because she always had it. What I hadn't done yet was understand why she did it. I had noticed the habit, the way I noticed the weight of her bag and the position she chose at the railing as data filed, not yet interrogated. I was still running the assessment, still deciding how much weight this door could carry. I did not know about her father yet. I did not know about the notebook. I did not know that in 3 weeks, a colleague named Rafferty would press 2 tickets to the Harman Pharma Foundation Awards dinner into my hand and tell me the client expected a face from the firm, and that I would say yes, mostly to have something to tell her about on the ferry, and that this would be the most consequential yes I had said in years. I only knew that on the mornings I took the 647 crossing, I got to the dock at 6:38. Not because I was early. Not because I was early. The Harmon Pharma Foundation Awards dinner was held in the atrium of the Cairo Cultural Center, which was the kind of building designed to make donors feel like patrons of civilization. High ceilings, brass railings that had never met a real railings job description. Waitstaff in black moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people paid to be furniture. My colleague Rafferty had described it as a working dinner. This was technically accurate the way a deep-sea pressure test is technically a swim. The room was full of pharmaceutical money, arranged in its social hierarchy, grant recipients near the edges, foundation board members at the center tables, and at the far end of the atrium, elevated on a low stage, under the kind of lighting specifically engineered to make powerful people look like they were standing inside their own legacy. There was a podium. There were 6 named plaques on a draped table. There was a string quartet playing something ambient enough to feel like the room itself was confident. The room expected gratitude. It was built for gratitude. Every sight line led to the stage. I was reading the table assignment card when I saw her. Nora was standing near the east windows with a glass of sparkling water she had not touched, wearing a dark dress I had never seen before, and looking at the room the way she looked at the harbor on mornings when the current was wrong, not with fear, with calculation, like she was mapping the exits. I had not told her I'd be here. She had not told me she'd be here. She saw me at almost exactly the moment I saw her. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she crossed the room, not toward me exactly, not away, at an angle, the way you just course so that meeting someone can look like it happened by chance. Marine engineer, she said. Food photographer, I said. She looked at her water glass. Then at me. My father is being honored tonight. I know. Rafferty's firm consults for Harmon. I'm here, as I paused, because moral support for a woman I see on a ferry was not language that translated to a name badge in a colleague. Of course. She said this without irony, which meant she was being careful. I had learned to read the difference between Nora's irony and Nora's carefulness. Irony she wore forward. Carefulness she wore like something that didn't quite fit anymore, but she had stopped noticing. Are you all right? I asked. She started to answer, and I watched it happen the beginning of a sentence that she rerouted before it arrived. I'm a pause. I came because my mother asked me to. They've been divorced for 6 years. She thought it would look worse if I wasn't here than if I was. That's a specific kind of logic. It's my family's native language. She looked toward the stage, then back at me. Her hand moved to the strap of her bag, adjusted it, settled. He's not a bad man, Dex. That's the complicated part. He's charming, and he believes in the work. She stopped herself again, found it easier to love things at a scale he could control. I said, her eyes came to mine. Not because I was finishing her sentence, not because I was trying to demonstrate that I knew her. I said it because it was plainly true, and she had been circling it for 30 seconds with the expression of someone who already knew the shape of the wall they were walking toward. She looked at me for a long moment. You do that too, she said quietly. Which part? Find scales you can control. I had nothing to say to that, which was its own answer. She gave me a short, not unkind look, and then Rafferty appeared at my shoulder to shepherd me toward the table assignment, and Nora drifted back toward the family section, and I watched her go with the distinct sensation of a man who has just been read by an instrument more precise than the ones he uses professionally. The ceremony started at 7:40. The foundation chair spoke for 9 minutes about the intersection of commerce and compassion. 3 grant recipients were acknowledged. A short film played, the kind assembled from footage of people in clinical settings looking meaningfully at cameras. Then Harlan Vashti took the stage. I understood immediately why the room loved him. He was 71, lean, with the particular ease of a man who had never once walked into a space and wondered whether he belonged there. He spoke without notes. He made eye contact with specific people in the audience and held it long enough to make them feel chosen. When he talked about the foundation's literacy and healthcare work, he used the word we with such practiced fluency that everyone present felt briefly included in something larger than a pharmaceutical company's tax strategy. He was magnetic. He was genuinely proud of the work. Both things were true. I found Nora's table. She was seated 4 rows in front of mine, between a woman I didn't recognize and an empty chair. Her back was straight. Her hands were in her lap. She was watching her father the way you watch a building, the stress history of not with hostility, with a kind of exhausted accuracy. She was not clapping between segments the way the room clapped. Her hands came together twice and stopped, like the motion didn't complete. Harlan Vashti reached the midpoint of his speech. He talked about his family's support over the years. His voice dropped into a register that rooms like this recognize as intimate, the strategic vulnerability of a successful man, briefly acknowledging his human dimension. He talked about his daughter, who had her mother's stubbornness and her father's eye for what matters. The room softened. The room was designed to soften. "I'd like to ask Nora to come up here," he said, smiling toward her table. "If she's willing." The applause started before she could answer. That is what rooms like this do. They begin applauding the expectation before the person can respond to it. The sound fills the space, and suddenly not standing up is not a preference, it is a refusal. Visible, documented, in front of 300 people who will remember your face if you stay seated. Nora's shoulders moved in a way that was not quite a breath and not quite a flinch. I stood up. I was not at her table. I want to be accurate about that because it matters for what happened next. It was not a small movement. I was 4 rows back, angled to the right, and I had to pass 2 other tables to reach hers. People noticed. Rafferty noticed. I did not look at Rafferty. I walked to Nora's table and sat down in the empty chair beside her. Not behind her, beside her. Close enough that our shoulders were proximate in a way that signals to a room. These people know each other. These people are mid-conversation. This is not the moment. I leaned toward her and said, at a volume calibrated for the table but not for the stage. The sandbar moved another centimeter. The modeling came back this afternoon. I need to show you the new load distribution before I send it to the client. I brought the diagrams. This was not true. There were no diagrams. The sandbar had not moved. I had received no modeling results that afternoon. What I had done was give her a sentence, a real one, specific, professional, the kind that requires a response, requires attention, requires the full reasonable apparatus of, I'm sorry, I can't come up right now. I'm needed here for something. Without a confrontation, without a no, without making her father's public invitation into a public wound. Nora looked at me. For 2 full seconds, she looked at me, and I watched the thing that was happening in her face. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been offered a door so quietly that they're still deciding whether they imagined it. Then she turned toward the stage. She smiled at her father. Briefly, genuinely. The way you smile at someone you have made your peace with at a distance, you have both agreed not to close. She touched her fingers to the table in a small gesture that meant not tonight. He held the smile 1 beat too long. Then he nodded, turned back to the room, and continued his speech. The applause moved on to something else. Rafferty stared at me from across the room with an expression I would deal with later. Nora did not speak for approximately 90 seconds. I did not fill the silence. I had learned on the ferry that her silences were not empty, they were load-bearing. You waited for them to complete themselves. Finally, she said, "You don't have the diagrams." "No." The sandbar didn't move. Not today specifically. A pause. It moves 3 centimeters a year. So technically, 1/3 of a millimeter today. I'm rounding up. She looked at the table. The corner of her mouth moved, and then she controlled it. She reached into her bag, the one that was never heavy enough for its size, and her fingers found something inside it without looking. A small spiral notebook with a dark cover, warped slightly along one edge, the way paper warps when it gets wet and dries wrong. She held it against her palm for a moment and then set it on the table in front of her. She did not open it. I had seen that notebook on the ferry. I had seen it before, the way you see something repeatedly without yet asking why. It's always there. It had the specific appearance of a thing carried not for use, but for presence. The way some people carry their mother's watch even when the battery is dead. My mother gave me that, she said, without me asking. The morning she left my father, she looked at the cover. She said, "Write down what you can't say out loud." "Have you?" "No. Simple, flat. I don't write things down. I take photographs." A pause. but I carry it. On stage, her father was rapping toward the end of his remarks. The room was warming toward applause again, that gathering wave that a room builds before it releases. Nora watched him. He called me difficult to reach, she said. When I was growing up, like I was a radio station, you had to work at tuning. Her thumb rested on the notebook's warped corner. My mother said I was just listening for static before I trusted the signal. I thought about the ferry, about the way she looked at the water for 4 months before she spoke to me, about the sentences she finished before people could finish them themselves, leaning forward to meet the thought before it arrived, the reflex of a person who had learned that what came next in a sentence could be without warning, without transition, something that changed the room, not because she was anxious in the ordinary way, because she had grown up in a house where the pause before a sentence landed was the most dangerous part of it. Nora, I said. She looked at me. You don't owe this room anything tonight. Her jaw moved slightly. Not a word, a decision being made about a word. Then the applause broke open for her father, and she looked away, and the notebook stayed on the table between us. And I did not pick it up, and she did not put it away. The dinner portion of the evening arrived, and Harlan Vashti moved through the room like weather, warm front, high pressure, leaving every table slightly elevated by the passage. He stopped at Nora's table for 4 minutes. I know because I watched from mine, and I timed it the way I time things. I need not to misread. He put his hand on her shoulder. She did not pull away. She also did not lean in. She smiled at the exact wattage required to make a room of 300 people believe the relationship was fine. And when he moved on to the next table, she reached for the notebook and placed it in her bag, not putting it away, returning it to where it was safe. Rafferty materialized at my shoulder at some point during the appetizer course and said, with the precision of a man choosing his words around a live wire, you sat at another table during the ceremony. I did, I said, with the honoree's daughter. Yes. Do you know her? We take the same ferry. Rafferty considered this. Is that a euphemism? It is not a euphemism, Rafferty. He looked across the room at Nora's table, then back at me. He had the expression of a man who has just discovered a load-bearing wall was never in the original blueprints and is deciding whether to be concerned or impressed. The Harmon partners are at table 7, he said finally. Your presence was requested. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I was not there in 20 minutes. I found her in the corridor outside the East Hall, near a fire exit that no one was using because the dinner was still in its first course, and no one leaves a room like that before the speeches are finished. She was standing with her back to the wall, not hiding, just outside the noise. The notebook was in her hand again. She hadn't opened it. There are 47 people in that room right now, she said, when she heard me, who genuinely believe my father is a great man. Is he not? He is. She looked at the notebook. He built a foundation that has provided healthcare access to 60,000 people in underserved communities. That is not nothing. That is an enormous something. A pause. He also called my mother from a conference in Lausanne on their anniversary to tell her he decided the marriage was structurally unsound. I said nothing. He used that word, she said. Structurally. I felt the specific discomfort of a man who uses that word professionally and understands immediately what it means when you apply it to a person. She was 44, Nora continued. She had given 37 job leads to colleagues instead of taking them herself because his career required mobility and someone had to stay calibrated. And he called from Lausanne and said structurally unsound, like he was filing a report. She turned the notebook over in her hands. She packed 2 bags and moved to her sister's by the time he landed. That's when she gave you the notebook. First morning after. She looked at the cover. She said, write down what you can't say out loud. She was not crying when she said it. She was just steady. The way people get steady when they've been preparing for a thing longer than they admitted. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind the wall, the string quartet was playing again, something from the second half of the evening's program. Did you write anything in it? I asked. Ever. Once. She paused. I wrote my name. Then I looked at it and decided that seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in a diary. And I wasn't going to keep a diary. And I crossed it out. So it has one crossed out name. It has one crossed out name and 6 years of caring. She looked up at me. Why are you out here, Dex? The Harmon partners are in there. Rafferty mentioned that. And I find load-bearing conversations more interesting than table assignments. She studied me with the particular attention she brought to things she was still deciding the light temperature of. You do that, she said. Make serious things sound technical. It's a habit. Where does it come from? I should have deflected. I had deflected this question in various forms from various people for approximately 12 years. But the corridor was quiet, and she had just told me about a phone call from Lausanne, and there is a specific unfairness in letting someone hand you weight without offering any back. My father was an engineer, I said. Civil, not marine. Bridges, mostly. He was the most rational man I have ever met, which meant he could make any decision sound like the only logical outcome. I looked at the fire exit sign above the door. He left when I was 16. Not dramatically. He explained it. He used phrases like long-term load distribution and inevitable structural drift. And I was 16 and smart enough to understand the engineering and old enough to know that what he was actually saying was, I calculated this, and this is the result. Nora did not finish that sentence. She waited. He was not wrong about the math, I said. That was the part that took years to sort out. The marriage was failing. He left before the worst of it. Some engineers would call that good judgment, a pause. I spent a long time trying to decide whether good judgment was something I wanted to inherit. She was quiet for a moment. And I inherited it anyway, I said. I just didn't like how it fit. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, not the directness she used for assessing things, not the carefulness she wore around her father, something more level than either. Like she was looking at the actual structure, not the load report. Dex, yes. The reason I finish people's sentences. She said it like she was picking up something she had set down earlier. It started because in my house, the pause before my father spoke was the worst part. You never knew if the next sentence was going to be ordinary or the kind that changed the shape of everything. So I learned to finish them first. If I got there before him, I could control what the sentence was. I did not speak. I know it's not she started. A great system long term, I said quietly. She stopped, not because I had finished her sentence, because I'd finished it with the words she had been trying not to say, the specific acknowledgement that the reflex she had built for survival had become its own kind of cage. The thing she had been walking around for years without saying out loud, her expression shifted. Something careful in it gave slightly, the way a joint gives under the right pressure, not breaking, adjusting. We were standing 2 feet apart. The corridor was still behind the wall. The quartet resolved something in a minor key. I was aware of the exact distance between us the way I am, aware of tolerances in a structure I'm responsible for precisely, continuously, without having to think about it. She was looking at me with the expression of a woman deciding whether to trust her own instruments. I should tell you, I almost said something then. I had the sentence. I could feel it, the way you feel the weight of something before you pick it up. It was not a complicated sentence. It was the simple kind, the kind that has no engineering to hide behind, that arrives in plain language and requires you to stand there while someone decides what to do with it. I did not say it. Not because I was afraid exactly, because I had spent 36 years calculating the load on declarations before making them. And some patterns have deeper foundations than a single quarter conversation can reach. Instead, I said, you should have some of the dinner. The appetizer looked reasonable. Nora looked at me for one more second. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not the full smile, the smaller one she gave when she had seen something clearly and decided not to press it. Reasonable, she repeated. High praise. I'm conservative with assessments. I've noticed. She shifted the notebook back into her bag. The motion was familiar by now, not putting it away so much as returning it to orbit. She was about to move toward the door when it opened from the inside and a woman came through it, early 40s, dark coat, carrying 2 glasses of wine with the purposeful air of someone who had gone to get them before the free bar closed. She stopped when she saw us. Nora. She looked at me. Then back at Nora. Then at the space between us with the attention of a woman who has known someone long enough to read their posture in a corridor outside a dinner they didn't want to attend. Petra, Nora said. This is Dex Calloway. We take the same ferry. Petra handed Nora one of the glasses. She did not stop looking at me with an expression I could not fully decode. Not unfriendly, not cautious. Calibrating. Marine engineer, I said. Food stylist, she said. I work with Nora. She looked between us once more, briefly, with the economy of someone cataloging information she will use later. They're about to start the award presentation inside. Your father will be looking for you. Nora nodded. She looked at me, a quick look. The functional kind. Nothing demonstrated, and then followed Petra through the door. I stood in the corridor. The fire exit sign hummed faintly. Somewhere behind the wall, applause started again for something I hadn't been present for. I stayed there for a moment, in the specific silence of a man who had the sentence and put it back, and thought about my father explaining his departure from a conference room in Lausanne. Good judgment, I thought. I did not like how it fit. The Lifetime Achievement Award was presented at 9:41. Harlan Vashti accepted it with a speech that lasted 6 minutes and contained 3 genuine moments I counted, not to be uncharitable, but because I'd spent the second half of the evening developing an involuntary habit of cataloging things that were real versus things that were performed, and the distinction mattered in a room like that one. The genuine moments were when he talked about the first clinic that opened under the foundation's funding in a township outside the city, and his voice thinned. When he looked down at the award for a half second before looking back up, and something private crossed his face. And when he said, without flourish, that he had made serious mistakes in his personal life, and that the work was not compensation for those mistakes, and that anyone who believed you could balance that kind of ledger was lying to themselves. The room applauded politely. Rooms like that do not love self-accountability. It disrupts the ambient glow. I looked for Nora. She was watching her father with the expression she brought to things she was still processing, not soft, not hard, something in between. The face of a woman recalibrating against new data. He found her during the reception after I was at the edge of the room, holding a drink I'd stopped tasting 40 minutes ago, when I saw Harlan Vashti cross to his daughter. Not with the room-working confidence he'd had all evening. Slower, with something in his posture that was almost not quite a man preparing to be refused. She did not refuse him. They spoke for 7 minutes. I was not close enough to hear it. At one point, her chin dropped slightly, and at another, she looked up at him with an expression I had not seen from her all evening, not the careful smile, not the calculated wattage, something rawer. He put his hand on her forearm. She looked at it. She did not move away. When he left, she stood still for a moment. Then she turned and walked directly toward the east corridor. I followed her. Not because she had asked me to. Not because I believed she couldn't handle the next 5 minutes alone. Because she had been handling things alone all evening, and some forms of consideration looked like absence when they're actually just distance managed politely. She was standing in the same spot as before, same wall, same fire exit sign. She had the notebook out again. She was holding it with both hands, which was different from how she usually held it, the same way she held her coffee on the ferry. Both hands, like it needed the full warmth of 2 palms to stay intact. He apologized, she said, before I asked. I waited, not for everything, not in a way that fixes anything. Just, she looked at the notebook cover. He said he had been better at caring about large numbers of people than about the small number of people who needed him to be less careful. A pause. He said he knew that. How did that feel? She thought about it, like finally hearing a structural report confirm damage you already knew was there. She looked up. It doesn't repair anything. But you stop wondering if you imagined the crack. The door opened. Petra came through it with 2 glasses of wine, again, same purposeful motion as before, and stopped when she saw the arrangement hadn't changed much since the last time she'd walked through that door. She looked at Nora. She looked at me. She handed Nora the wine. Your father is looking for you for the group photograph, she said. Nora nodded. She didn't move yet. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't expected from a woman I'd met 40 minutes ago. She leaned against the wall beside Nora, looked at nothing in particular, and said, in 6 years of working together, I have never once seen you wait for the end of a sentence. Nora frowned slightly. What? You finished them. Everyone's. Mine, the client's, the photographer's assistant who can't stop starting sentences with basically. Petra took a sip of her wine. You've been doing it since I've known you. It's not rude. It's just you get there first. Always. She paused. Tonight, with him, a small gesture in my direction. You don't. You just wait. The corridor was very quiet. I noticed it at the table, Petra continued, with the evenness of a woman reporting a fact. When he sat down next to you, you started to say something, and you stopped. Waited. Let it be unfinished. She looked at Nora. I've been your colleague for 6 years, Nora. I know what your face looks like when you're holding a room at distance. A pause. That wasn't the face. Nora said nothing. I said nothing. Petra looked at me for the first time since she'd come in. She's been taking the same ferry for 4 months, she said. She mentioned it once, in October. She said there was a man at the railing who looked like he was solving something. A beat. She mentioned it 3 more times after that without noticing. She kept bringing it up. Then Petra finished her wine, set the glass on the small ledge by the fire exit, and said, "The group photograph is in 10 minutes," and went back through the door. The door closed. The corridor stayed quiet. Nora was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who has just been handed information she already had and is deciding whether being named changes anything. Petra's very direct, I said, because someone had to say something. She's been like that since we met. Nora's thumb moved across the notebook cover. She told me on our second job together that I was the most technically skilled and emotionally defended person she'd ever worked with. And then she asked if I wanted to get lunch. A pause. I said yes. It seemed safer than arguing. I looked at her. She looked at me. And then she did something that I had not anticipated and will not forget. She opened the notebook. She'd been carrying it for 6 years. Blank pages. One crossed out name. She opened it to the second page, smoothed it flat against her palm, and took the pen from her bag. She held it over the paper for a moment. The way you hold yourself still before doing something you've been deciding for a long time. She wrote something. Small. I could not read it from where I stood. Then she closed the notebook and held it out to me. My mother said, "Write down what you can't say out loud." She was looking at me with a steadiness that showed up when the carefulness dropped. She didn't say I had to be the only one who read it. I took the notebook. I opened it. She had written, "I think the ferry broke down on purpose." I looked at her. Her chin was up. The expression of a woman who has made a choice and is standing inside it without backup. I thought about the service vessel arriving at 9/3, about the word "not yet" in my chest, about 4 months of standing at the same railing and calling it the quiet. I closed the notebook and held it back out to her. She took it. "Nora," I said. "Yes." I got to the dock at 6:38 every morning. She looked at me. Something moved in her face, fast, genuine. The expression of a person who has just had a thing they suspected confirmed, not with drama, but with the clean simplicity of a fact stated plainly. "The ferry leaves at 6:47, she said. "Yes, that's 9 minutes early." "That's correct." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped forward and kissed me. Not tentatively, not as a question. Nora did everything with the deliberateness of a woman who had already calculated the approach and was done with the preliminary phase. Her hand came to my jaw, not my shoulder, not my lapel, my jaw, turning me slightly toward her as if to correct for something, and I put my hand at her waist and felt the small tremor that moved through her, which was not uncertainty, which was courage having its physical response. When we broke apart, the fire exit sign hummed above us. Her forehead rested near my chin. "That," she said quietly, "was a very long ferry ride. Almost 5 months." I said, "I kept thinking you were going to say something. I kept assessing the load." She laughed once, a short, real sound, the kind that doesn't perform itself for anyone. Her hand was still near my jaw. She let it drop slowly. She was giving me back to the regular air by degrees. "Petra is going to be insufferable," she said. She seemed like someone who had earned it. She has. Nora looked at the notebook in her hand. Then she slipped it into her bag. And this time the gesture was different, not returning it to orbit, putting it somewhere it had actually been used. We went into the photograph. Her father looked at us once, assessment, the specific attention of a man who notices things about his daughter that he no longer has the standing to comment on. Then he looked away. and the photographer arranged everyone under the lights. And Nora stood beside me without being asked, and I was aware of the 3 inches between our arms the way I am aware of tolerances and structures I am responsible for. Outside, an hour later, the night was cold and clear. She had called a car. We stood on the steps of the cultural center while it came, our breath visible in the dark. I have a shoot Tuesday, he said. I have sight drawings Monday, the Ferry, Wednesday, the Ferry, Wednesday. She looked at the street. The car appeared at the end of the block, headlights moving through the dark. Dex. Yes. Ask me properly. I looked at her. She was watching the approaching car with a small smile that she was not suppressing. I had learned by now that Nora did not suppress the smiles she meant, only the ones she hadn't decided on yet. Will you have dinner with me? I said. Not a ferry, not a gala, somewhere with a bad wine list and tables that are too close together and a waiter who calls everyone by the wrong name. The car pulled up. She turned toward me. The smile had become the real one, the unhurried, unperformed kind. The kind she gave you briefly and honestly, like something cupped against the wind. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. She got in the car. I stood on the steps until the taillights turned the corner, and then I stood there a moment longer, and I thought about a notebook that had been carried for 6 years with a single crossed-out name, and what it meant that it now had something else in it, not a crossed-out name, a sentence that knew exactly where it was going. The restaurant had 7 tables and a wine list written on a chalkboard in handwriting, so confident it was probably wrong about at least 2 of the vintages. The waiter called me chief and called Nora boss and called the special a pasta situation, and Nora looked at me over her menu with an expression of such pure, unguarded delight that I had to look back at the wine list to recover. This place, she said, is exactly what I promised. It smells like garlic and good decisions. High praise, I said. I'm conservative with assessments. She pointed her menu at me. You can't use my own line. I'm borrowing it, engineering term. She laughed. Not the small, controlled version. The real one, sudden, complete, briefly embarrassed by itself. It was the 3rd time I had heard it. I had been counting, not because I was keeping records, but because some things arrive and you want to know exactly how many times they've happened. We ate pasta and talked until the restaurant needed the table back. She told me about her grandmother's kitchen, where she had learned that light changed food, that the same plate of food photographed at noon looked clinical, photographed at 4 in the afternoon, looked like a memory. I told her about the first bridge I ever had a structural hand in, footbridge over a creek outside the city, which was not impressive by any engineering standard, but which I drove 40 minutes out of my way to cross for the first 3 months after it opened, not because I was checking the tolerances, because I needed to feel it hold. She was quiet when I said that. You needed it to hold, she said. Yes. Not just the bridge. I looked at her. No, not just the bridge. The waiter called us chief and boss one more time and brought the check without being asked, which was either efficient or a hint. Nora split it before I could object, with the practiced speed of a woman who had made a principle of it. Outside, she tucked her hand into the crook of my arm without asking, and we walked 2 blocks in the cold, and I thought, this is what I was afraid of, not this specifically, this ease, this particular weight that felt nothing like damage. That was March. By April, I knew she took her coffee black on shoot days, and with milk on days, she was editing, because editing required patience, and patience required comfort. I knew she kept a second notebook, a functional one, notes and shot lists, and that this one she wrote in constantly, and that the original notebook lived in the same bag, but never came out on days when things were going well, only on days when something had been harder than expected. The anchor object of a woman who did not need it when she felt secure, which told me more about the shape of her anxiety than anything she had directly said. She learned my silences the way she learned light by type. She could distinguish between the silence I used when I was working through a structural problem jaw, slightly forward lean, complete unawareness of the room, and the silence I used when I was in a conversation. I wanted to extend, still attentive, deliberately not checking my watch, and the silence I used when something had landed in me that I hadn't finished processing yet, hands around whatever I was holding, eyes not quite focused. She named the third one the loading dock. You go to the loading dock, she would say, and wait. And she never once filled the waiting with something worse. Cassius met her in May and told me afterwards, with characteristic precision, she's the first person you've brought around who doesn't seem like she's been structurally approved. I told him I didn't know what that meant. Yes, you do, he said. I did. Rafferty met her at a firm event and spent 11 minutes asking her about food photography with the enthusiasm of a man who had just discovered a subject he'd had no idea he cared about. And Nora answered every question with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, as if the question deserved the full version of the answer, not the version edited for a stranger. She listens like it cost her something, Rafferty told me later, not as a criticism, as a fact he was still turning over. In June, she took me on a shoot, a restaurant in the West Quarter that wanted its summer menu documented before the season changed. I sat off to one side and watched her work for 4 hours, which was not something she'd asked me to do and not something I did to demonstrate support. I did it because I wanted to understand the discipline, the specific intelligence of a person who arranged light around perishable things and found meaning in the narrowness of the window. She moved around the tables with a patience that looked effortless and was clearly not. She adjusted the angle of a water glass 3 times. She waited 11 minutes for the afternoon light to reach a particular corner of the room. When it did, she took 4 photographs in 20 seconds and then said, quietly, to no one in particular, there. I understood something then that I had been approaching from the wrong direction for months. She had spent her life photographing things designed to disappear because she understood impermanence better than most people, not as loss, but as urgency. The window is narrow. You arrange the light while you have it. You don't calculate whether the photograph is structurally sound. You take it. I had been calculating whether the photograph was structurally sound. She was taking it. Not because she was reckless, because she had decided that the window mattered more than the margin for error. I drove home that evening and sat in my car outside my building for a while, and I thought about sandbars that move 3 centimeters a year, and about the specific cowardice of knowing something is shifting and adjusting nothing until the anchor point fails. Then I went inside and called her and told her the shoot had been the most interesting 4 hours I'd had in recent memory, which was true, and that I was in love with her, which arrived in the middle of the sentence about the shoot without announcement, without the weight I had been anticipating, just as a fact that had apparently been load-bearing for longer than I'd acknowledged. She was quiet for a moment. The loading dock, she said softly. Not this time, I said. This time I'm just telling you. Another moment. I know, she said. I've known for a while. A pause. I've been waiting for you to catch up. 1 year after the ferry broke down, we took the 647 crossing on a Thursday morning. Same starboard railing, 3rd stanchion from the bow. The harbor gray-green under early cloud, the city coming into focus on the south shore. She held her coffee with both hands. I stood beside her, not proximate beside. What are you thinking about? She asked. Load distribution, I said. She glanced at me. Specifically, I said about how I spent 9 years calculating how much weight something could carry before it failed, and it never once occurred to me to calculate the other direction. What's the other direction? How much weight something needs to carry before it's actually useful? She looked back at the water. Her hand shifted from her coffee cup and found mine at the railing. We did not speak again until the south dock. The ferry took 11 minutes. The current was calm. The city received us the same way it always did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any awareness that something important was happening in the ordinary light of a Thursday morning. That was fine. We knew. I have spent my career building things to stand against the water. She was the first thing I decided to build toward. If you've ever been the person who got to the dock 9 minutes early and called it nothing, if you've ever stood next to something that mattered and filed it under quiet, sustainable, load-bearing, tell me about it in the comments. What finally made you stop calculating and just say the thing? And if you've ever been the one who waited, who let the silence be unfinished while someone found their way to you, I want to hear that story too. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.